Welcome, everybody, to our first lecture of the semester. What is social psychology? So, good question. Well, after reading chapter 1 and after this lecture, hopefully you'll have a better understanding of what is involved in social psychology and some of the history, how it came about as a field or subfield within psychology. So your textbook defines social psychology as the scientific study of how individuals think, feel, and behave in a social context. And that's a pretty decent definition, pretty comprehensive. However, there's some components of this definition that we should probably take a look at in a little bit more detail. First is, what do we mean by scientific study? The second is, what's this issue of how individuals think, feel, and behave? And finally, what do we mean by a social context? So let's break down this definition into a couple more manageable parts so we can fully understand what we mean by social psychology. Well, scientific study, social psychology applies the scientific method in order to study the human condition. Humans are inherently social creatures, and we spend a lot of time interacting with other people. Other people have a lot of influence on us, and we have a lot of influence on other people. And I'm sure we've all gone people watching at some point in our lives. And people watching is certainly interesting, especially if you live in New York City and ride the subways. I've spent many hours doing some people watching, but people watching per se is not very systematic, right? We're observing, but not in a systematic way. I might observe one person in a certain way and observe another person in a completely different way, in a completely different environment, right? So the scientific method involves systematic observation. It means that observations are going to take place in a uniform type of manner. The scientific method also involves description. So as a psychology student, as an undergrad and as a graduate student, while I did my people watching, was in my head trying to make descriptions of what I was seeing, but mostly it was just for entertainment value, right? So the scientific method also not just strives to systematically observe, but also strives to describe what exactly it is that is being observed. And finally, the scientific method involves measurement of some kind. So again, people watching, particularly if it was somebody who was doing a repetitive motion, I might in my head count how many times they were engaged in that motion or that behavior, but that is probably not necessarily a reliable method of measurement to use, right? Counting or frequencies are certainly certain types of measurement, but I wasn't necessarily doing it in any type of systematic way. Maybe I wasn't paying attention. Maybe I missed a couple of motions or movements. Might have been good to have someone next to me who was watching that same person and also counting, so we can compare my number to their number to see whether or not there was some inter-rater reliability, right? Did we catch all of them? Did we kind of see the same thing going on? So the scientific method involves these three main components, and social psychology uses these scientific method and these three components to study human behavior in a social context. Okay, so this next component of the definition, how individuals think, feel, and behave. So social psychology is, it concerns a diverse set of topics, as we'll see. some of these topics include private and even unconscious beliefs and attitudes. When we get to chapter 5, I believe, on chapters 5 and 6, I believe, on discrimination and our chapter on attitudes in general, we'll see that some of our attitudes, some of our biases are not necessarily known to us. There's such a thing called implicit attitudes, and there's actually tests that can measure these type of implicit attitudes or implicit biases. So social psychology tries to get into or tap into some of those private or unconscious attitudes and beliefs that people might have. Social psychology is also interested in how people feel about other people or other situations. So we're interested in people's emotions and people's behaviors, how they act, particularly in public settings, right? So how a social situation or a public situation might influence people's behaviors. You might not always realize it, but the social environment has a profound impact on how we behave, not just in terms of conformity, which again is an issue that we will talk about, but in terms of how we present ourselves. Sometimes we want to present ourselves in a way that kind of reflects who we are. And other times we want to present ourselves in a way that we want other people to think of us as, right? So we want to kind of, let's say, enhance our presentation. So social psychology is interested in all of those things. Again, the focus with social psychology is on the individual, and we'll see how there are some fields and some subfields of psychology and other disciplines that might be interested in some of the same things that social psychologists are interested in. However, for us, the focus is on the individual within these situations, not, say, society at large or institutions. We're concerned with the individual. Okay, finally, social context, right? So when we speak about the social context, again, we're interested in how humans are behaving amongst other humans, essentially. Now, the socialness of, say, social psychology can vary at times, right? Sometimes we're looking at direct group processes, meaning we're literally looking at how people are influencing each other one-on-one when they're in the same room. Sometimes we're interested in how online communication might affect other people. There's still a social component there, but less so, right? People behave differently online than they do in person. I'm sure you even noticed this by taking online classes, how you might struggle with some aspects of online classes because you're used to in-person classes. So maybe you're a little less motivated. Maybe you're browsing the web or playing with your phone more during this lecture right now when you should be paying attention. People do that, students do that all the time in the classroom, right? But it's more covert. It's under the table, you sneak a peek at a text. But now that it's online, we tend to feel de-individuation. There's less inhibition. We have this sense of anonymity online, which we probably shouldn't, right? So people who sometimes people will post some crazy things online that I'm like, you probably shouldn't post that. They think they're anonymous, but Facebook has your IP address. They have all the cookies that are in your internet, they've got more information on you than your mom and has on you, right? But it doesn't feel that way. It feels differently. Okay, so relevant thoughts and feelings of, or feelings and behaviors, either one, concern other people, or are two, influenced by other people. Either way, there's a other person aspect that's associated with how we're acting, how we're feeling, and how we're thinking. At least that's what we're concerned about as social psychologists. Now, the interesting thing is that these other people that we're talking about here don't have to actually be present to have an effect on you. They actually don't even have to be real to have an effect on you. So you can think about, just say your mom, right? Think about your mom or your dad or grandma or a caretaker of yours, what they might say or think about this behavior you're about to engage in. They're not present to know what's going on, but they can still influence your thoughts and your feelings and your actual behaviors. Again, these people don't even have to be real. Take a look at great works of fiction, or even say pop works of fiction. People identify with characters in books and in movies, in comic books. All of these different characters, what they think of us or what they might think of us, right, can affect how we think and how we feel and how we behave. So it's pretty interesting, right, in that sense. I think so, at least, is that we're that social. We care so much, or we rely on other people so much so that they don't even have to be real people, and they can still affect us in pretty profound ways. Okay, so some, say, questions and applications that social psychologists might be interested in. One deals with social perception. So social perception is all about what affects the way we perceive ourselves and perceive others. So a social psychologist might be interested in, why do people sometimes sabotage their own performance, making it more likely than they will fail. We're probably all guilty of that at some point in our lives, that we kind of set ourselves up for failure. And that's likely, we're going to talk about that in chapter 3, apparently, it says here. But some people might be more inclined to do that than others. Even though chances are we've all done it or will do it at some point in our lives, right? Another question might be, how do people in East Asia often differ from North Americans in the way they explain people's behavior? In other words, do people in East Asia make different attributions than, say, Americans or Canadians, North Americans, right? The answer is yes, and we'll talk about that more in chapter 4. Another area that is of interest to social psychologists is social influence. So how do we influence each other? Some questions that a social psychologist might ask is, why do we often like what we suffer for? Think about it. Something that we work really, really hard for, lots of blood, sweat, and tears, is really hard to give up. It often helps explain why people stay in marriages and relationships that are difficult or even abusive sometimes. You put a lot of suffering into that. It's hard to let go of something. That's a question that will be answered in this class that we will talk about. just a handful of others. You could read these for yourself here. But how do salespeople sometimes trick us into buying things that we never really wanted? Chapter 7, social influence and persuasion. It's one of my favorite chapters there. Again, you can read some of these for yourself, either on the screen and definitely in your textbook, because you all did the reading, right? But you can see that there's a wide range of questions that social psychologists might ask. And these are a whole bunch, all of these questions we will explore in this class. Okay, so how is social psychology similar and different to some of the related fields? Well, let's start off with comparing social psychology and sociology. I will start with this because there's often a lot of similar interest in topics. It's just the way that these topics are approached are different, depending if you're taking a social psychological approach or a sociological approach. So how are these fields different? Well, sociology tends to focus on the group. So sociology will tend to focus on either a country or a society or a social institution, or even literally a large group. Whereas social psychology tends to focus on the individual. So sociologists might be interested in different institutional factors within a society that causes poverty amongst a certain group of people, whereas social psychologists would be interested in the effects of poverty on an individual, right? On that individual person. So similar overall interests, just very different levels of analyses. Sociology is more of a meta type of analysis, a grander type of analysis, where the social psychology or social psychologist is going to take the individual type of analysis. How do the fields intersect? Well, they, again, often will share the same training, and social psychologists and sociologists will often publish in the same journals. Even some of my research dealing with gender and sexuality discrimination has appeared in sociology journals that are, let's say, very sympathetic to social psychology. Also, both fields can help in understanding societal and immediate factors that influence behavior, right? So combined, social psychology and sociology actually can do a pretty thorough job at explaining these types of social issues. We could explain poverty on a societal level and on an individual level, the effects of poverty, let's say, on an individual. Okay, so social psychology and related fields here. So these are just a few other fields that, say, social psychology is related to, but still has some differences here. So to see the difference between social psychology and related fields, consider an example of how researchers in each field might conduct a study of prejudice. So the field of study is examined or is an example of how a researcher in the field might study prejudice. Sociologists might measure how prejudice varies as a function of social or economic class, to see whether people from different social or economic classes differ in their levels of prejudice towards a certain group. Clinical psychologists might test various therapies and various treatment options for people with antisocial personalities who exhibit great levels of prejudice. A personality psychologist might develop a questionnaire to identify who are very high or very low in their degree of prejudice towards, say, women or gays and lesbians or transgender people, so on and so forth. A cognitive psychologist might manipulate exposure to a member of some category of people and then measure the thoughts and concepts that are automatically activated. Right? So cognitive psychologists might be interested in some of those unconscious thought processes that are going on, or even the conscious thought processes. They might be interested in, say, things like stereotype activation. Stereotypes are really just heuristics, or really just mental shortcuts. And a social psychologist might manipulate various kinds of contact between individuals of different groups and examine the effect of this contact on the degree of prejudice that's exhibited. So again, we can approach the issue of prejudice from various different perspectives. The social psychological perspective is interested in the individual, number one, and also the individual in a social context, putting, say, people together to see whether or not that's going to affect levels of prejudice. So, comparing social psychology and clinical psychology, how are they different? Well, clinical psychologists seek to understand and treat people who have psychological difficulties or disorders. Social psychologists instead focus on the more typical ways in which people think, feel, and behave and influence each other. So clinical psychologists are looking more for or are more concerned with the deviations from the norms. Social psychologists are more interested in how do we typically interact, right? What are the more common ways or the usual ways, for lack of a better term there? And how do these fields interact? Well, actually, in a lot of different ways. For example, both might address how people cope with anxiety or pressure in social situations. Most of our anxiety comes from social causes. A lot of our mental health issues are actually caused by other people, right? Or our interactions with other people. Most of our stress comes from dealing with other people. So other people are actually a cause of a lot of our problems. So, and if you've been in therapy, or if you ever go into therapy, or if you ever want to conduct therapy as a profession, you'll notice that you spend a lot of time talking about relationships with people in these therapy sessions. So lots of overlap between those two fields. Social psychology and personality psychology, at one point, there was really no difference between these two fields. You would basically get a degree, a PhD in social and personality psychology. Why? Well, because both are interested in the individual and in individual differences, right? But there are some pretty significant differences, or they diverge in pretty significant ways. Personality psychologists are interested in individual differences as a function of traits, right? And traits are things that don't change. These don't change very often, or not easily changed, rather. So personality psychologists are interested in how we might think and feel and behave as a function of these traits that we're usually born with or develop at a pretty early age. Social psychologists, on the other hand, are much more interested in how the situation at hand is affecting the individual. So social psychology kind of doesn't really have room for this notion of traits, because according to most social psychologists, people are going to behave in ways that the situation demands them to, right? Or influences them to. So that means sometimes I'm introverted, sometimes I'm not, sometimes I'm extroverted, right? So personality psychologists would say, well, you're introverted, and you were born with that, and you'll probably always be that way. But maybe not. Maybe I'm only introverted among people I don't know. Maybe once you get a drink in me or two in me, I'm the life of the party. I'm completely extroverted. So maybe I just have social anxiety. Maybe it's not a personality trait at all, right? So how do they intersect? Well, like I said, both are very interested in individual differences. So they actually can complement each other in trying to explain those individual differences. And both may actually examine how situational factors interact with those individual differences. So personality psychologists do allow for the environment to have an impact on our behavior. They're not 100% relying on these personality traits that are not changeable. They just don't put as much emphasis as on the environment or situation as social psychologists do. Social psychology and cognitive psychology. Well, you're basically talking to a social cognitive psychologist. These two fields have become, say, closer and closer together in terms of how they approach, let's say, not just how they approach, but what questions they're interested in. Social psychology basically uses cognitive principles to explain how humans behave and think and feel in social situations, right? So a cognitive psychologist might be interested in studying mental processes such as thinking and learning, remembering and reasoning. And social psychologists might be interested in all of those same processes, but within a social setting, right? So they intersect in that they are very closely related, and this notion of social cognition has become an incredibly important area within the field of social psychology, and so much so that I would say a large portion of this class, or the majority of this class, can be considered social cognition. Right? Don't tell that to Charlene Christie, who is our legit old school social psychologist. She wouldn't be happy that I said that. I'm teasing with her, of course. So social psychology and common sense, because some of the stuff that we are going to be talking about during the semester, you're going to say, well, yeah, I knew that, or no, we didn't need a study to tell us that, right? There's a lot of 2020 hindsight when it comes to issues involving social psychology. So we have this phenomenon, this knew it all along phenomenon, right? Again, 2020 hindsight. Yeah, you knew it all along, except when you didn't know it. It's just now that you know the result. Now, that totally makes sense. So common sense seems to explain a lot of these social psychological findings after the fact. A lot of what we take as common sense, though, when we test it empirically, is not common sense at all. We'll see throughout the semester that research findings are going to probably overturn a lot of what you think is actually true. what you just take as common sense. For example, the idea that opposites attract. You might say, well, yeah, that's just common sense. Except absolutely not. That's not what the research shows at all, right? And then when we explain why opposites might not attract, you might say, oh, well, yeah, of course. Well, that totally makes sense, right? And that's cool. I understand where common sense would come in when trying to explain social psychological phenomena, because social psychology tends to study everyday type of interactions, things like conformity, right, and obedience, and just social interactions that we experience all the time, or that we witness all the time. So, our brains, we might have some intuition about how these findings, or how these studies might come out in terms of the research findings, except that we're often wrong about it, right? And there's reasons for that, which we'll get to once we get to perceiving others, and biases. Essentially, we tend to see what we expect to see, or what we want to see, right? But unlike common sense, social psychology, again, uses the scientific method to put its theories to the test. So we don't have to rely on intuition or our common sense. We'll use science to test it. And we often, very often, overrule common sense, let's say, or we turn common sense on its head. Okay, so we'll do a very, very down and dirty, brief history of social psychology. Your textbook might go into more detail about this, and if you were to take a history and systems class, which I totally suggest that you do, the history of psychology in general is fascinating. To see how it emerged from philosophy and from physiology, essentially, right? But a brief history of social psych. Well, we see in the late 1800s, early 1900s, some psychologists who were kind of dabbling in areas that we would consider social psychology, or social psychological areas nowadays, right? So the first three social psychology textbooks were published by McDougall in 1908, Ross 1908, and Alport 1924. Now, once a textbook is published in an area, this is kind of the first step in becoming a legitimate, recognized subfield. Like I said, late 1800s, people were fiddling around, doing some experiments, publishing some research that was social psychology. Norm Triplett, for example, was doing some research on social facilitation, which we'll talk about in the late 1800s. But these three and their textbooks kind of like started the field officially, let's say, or started was like the first official step at getting social psychology recognized as a field. Once we, let's say, get to the World War II era, so the events leading up to World War II, and then of course the World War II, and the events shortly after. This was really social psychology's heyday, so the 1930s to the 1950s. Why? Well, because we had the atrocities of World War II and Nazi Germany. And if we were to name a person who had the most significant impact on the field of social psychology, it was likely Adolf Hitler. not because he was a social psychologist, but because of all the crazy and barbaric things that he did and his ability to get the German people to go along with this barbarism. This raised so many questions for social psychologists, particularly because a lot of these psychologists were from Germany, and they escaped to the United States or to Western Europe to avoid Nazi Germany. So they knew the German people. They knew that the Germans were not some barbarians. They knew that there was something going on, that maybe this was not unique. Maybe this could happen to anybody, right? And we start seeing research on prejudice, research on conformity, research on obedience starting to all come about during this time. It was a really prolific period for social psychology. We see the first social psychological society, professional society form, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, or SPICY, as we call it, formed in 1936. We have Sheriff's groundbreaking experiment on social influence, particularly informational conformity or informational influence, which we'll talk about. Also coming in during 1936. We have Kurt Lewin, who was another important contributor to the field. He believed that behavior is a function of the interaction between the person and the environment, and this became known as the interactionist perspective. So the interactionist perspective, we could often think of it in terms of some type of interaction between personality traits and the environment. So the interactionist approach or interactionist perspective says, well, we might have these internal things that, whether we call them traits or dispositions, that will interact with the environment to cause certain types of behaviors. So, putting a good person in a bad situation might result in some bad behavior. It depends. There's going to be some interaction between that person's character, their disposition, and the situation they find themselves in. So during this time, we see that the government work in World War II was to protect soldiers from enemies' propaganda, to persuade citizens to support the war effort, and to select officers for various positions. So the government of the US was using social psychology to help with the war effort. World War II also led to examining, again, the nature of prejudice, aggression, and conformity. So some names that you should keep in mind: Gordon Allport, very important researcher in the field of prejudice and discrimination. In 1953, he published his book, The Nature of Prejudice. Solomon Asch is a name that we're going to revisit once we get to the chapter on conformity. So he had very significant and very interesting research on conformity. And Leon Festinger, this was his research on social comparison, is germane to this era. Festinger also did research on cognitive dissonance, which we'll also examine during this semester. Okay, so once we had this, heyday, or this call of action, this great, expansion of social psychology, we kind of get into an era of uneasiness in the field. that's often, well, your book calls it confidence in crisis. So this ranges from the 1960s to the mid 1970s. And a big part of this, say, crisis was whether or not laboratory studies were legitimate. Meaning that, do laboratory studies really capture how people think, feel, and behave? It's an artificial environment, right? And also, during this time, the 1960s and 70s, we had various social rights movements happening. We had the civil rights movement, we had the sexual revolution, we had the women's rights movement, second wave women's rights movement. They were calling into question the participants that were taking place, or that were taking part in these studies. Most of these studies were coming out of Ivy League schools, which only admitted males. So the vast majority of these studies had upper class, middle to upper class white young men as their participants. So there was some pushback to let's say the exclusion of multiple perspectives, or even the lack of diversity concerning the participants that were involved. At the same time, the field was still growing, and there was a lot of enthusiasm about that growth, even with these, concerns that were being raised. And of course, during this time, we see Stanley Milgram's famous research on obedience, which had a profound impact on the field and spurred a whole bunch more research during this time. So from the mid 70s to basically where we are now, we say we're in the age of pluralism. This crisis that we had actually led to a stronger discipline. We have much more rigorous ethical standards. So some of those earlier research studies, some of the ones that are really kind of cool, really kind of interesting, we wouldn't be able to do them now, because they used deception, they used techniques that might have been harmful to their participants. So we have more rigorous ethical standards. We have more stringent procedures to protect against bias in our studies, and there's more attention to possible cross-cultural differences. And definitely understanding that we need diverse samples, not just for the sake of diversity, but to make our research more valid, right? We also see the emergence of pluralism, is that we're not relying solely on laboratory studies. We can use multiple methods to study a particular area of interest, right? So there's an acceptance of different methods of investigation. However, to be honest, laboratory studies are still the gold standard. It's just the way it is. Survey research is becoming, say, more visible in the literature, and some other types of non-experimental research is becoming, let's say, more visible. So we're seeing more of it. However, there's usually an experimental component to that study as well. We also see a development of international and multicultural perspectives. So we're not relying on just, the United States or Western type of approach. We're taking a look at how participants from different cultures, or how different cultural systems might influence an individual. Okay, so psychology today, where are we at? well, in that age of pluralism, of course, we have this integration of emotion, motivation, and cognition. So, emotion is and motivation both have largely been left out, let's say, or has not received the same type or amount of attention that cognition has in recent years or throughout the history of social psych or cognitive psych for that matter. So when we talk about things like cognition and these mental processes that are involved, this is often referred to as the cold perspective, right? So it's cold because it's methodical. It's about brain processes and functioning. But when we speak about the hot perspective, this is when we're interested in, let's say, people's emotions and people's motivations as potential determinants of their thoughts and their feelings and their actions. So we're actually starting to see researchers incorporating not just the cold perspective into understanding a research question or doing research, but also integrating this hot perspective as well. So not only just focusing on the mental processes that are involved, but also focusing on the emotion that's involved and the motivational factors that are involved. So there's growing interest in distinguishing between automatic and controllable processes, and understanding their relationship. So this is something that we will talk about in chapter 5, this idea of implicit bias, right? So these, or implicit attributions, or even when we think about stereotypes and how stereotypes are activated, they're often activated automatically. We don't consciously see somebody and then think about, like, consciously say, oh, let me recall the stereotypes that I have about this group of people that they might belong to, right? That stereotype is automatically activated. So we're interested in some of those, becoming more and more interested in some of those automatic processes, as well as these non-automatic or these controllable processes. We are also becoming more comfortable, let's say, or becoming more likely to entertain incorporating genetic and evolutionary approaches. This is something that you'll see me do in this class, particularly when we start talking about the social self. When we get to chapter 3. Why is the genetic and evolutionary approach say important? Well, because as social animals, it's likely we got this far in our evolutionary journey because we cooperated, or at least because we cooperated with our own groups, right? So we might have not made it this far if we did not learn to cooperate through our evolution. I say learn very generously, right? Basically, evolution would have weeded out people who were not cooperative because they would have less chance to survive. So they would not have been able to pass on those uncooperative genes. But behavioral genetics examines the effects of genes on behaviors. One thing to keep in mind that their genes do not directly cause anything. We all have genes in our bodies related to many different things. Just because you have a gene for something does not mean that it's going to be expressed in some way. Genes need to interact with some environmental factor, particularly in order for it to have an effect on people's behaviors, right? when we talk about behavioral genetics, we're talking about how genes influence behavior. Evolutionary psychology uses the principles of evolution to understand human behavior. And again, we'll certainly do some of that in this class, particularly when it comes to the need to belong and our propensity to lump people into either in groups, you're either with us, or out groups, you're against us, right? When it comes to various cultural perspectives, first we need to define exactly what culture is. What do we mean by culture? Well, culture is the system of enduring meanings and beliefs and values, assumptions, institutions, practices that are shared by a large group of people and that are transmitted from one generation to the next. So that's an important part right there. Is that these are these values and beliefs and institutions that get passed down over multiple generations, and you can see by getting passed down, they become ingrained within a group of people, and having a particular type of culture, or having a culture that says we should act in one way, or we should think in this type of way, or we should treat people in that type of way, we could see how culture can have a profound impact on how we think, feel, and behave. Cross-cultural research is used to evaluate the universal generality or cultural specificity of theories or findings. In other words, are there some aspects of cultures that are universal? For example, the golden rule, do unto others as you want done unto you. You find that in pretty much every culture that has ever existed. Because a culture that didn't follow the golden rule probably wouldn't last very long, right? So there are some generalities, even different way, or let's say the way that we express emotions, tend to be similar across cultures. What we find attractive, not necessarily what we find attractive. The attraction, you'll see, is complicated. Attraction is both objective and subjective, right? Culture can have an impact on what we deem to be attractive. At the same time, people from across cultures tend to agree on what is an attractive face, right? So when it comes to other type of body modifications or decorations or the way we dress, those things might change over time. But an attractive face is pretty much universally rated as an attractive face. Multicultural research examines racial and ethnic groups within cultures, right? So, United States, clearly, there's a culture, and say a larger culture, but there are so many other cultures within that larger culture, tons and tons of them. So there's lots of opportunities to examine how people within those subcultures or even countercultures that exist, how they think and feel and behave within those cultures, and also to find commonalities that exist between these subcultures and even countercultures. So speaking of some political and moral issues that might arise in terms of studying how humans interact with one another, this notion of behavioral economics. This is how psychology, particularly social and cognitive psychology, relates to economic decision making. So using psychology social psychology, cognitive psychology, to not just understand economic decision making, but maybe even to influence economic decision making. When it comes to politics and moral philosophy, this brings together a mix of social psychology, political science, philosophy, and neuroscience. So we're starting to see even some of my research has a tinge of politics involved in it. Why? Well, because politics is inherently social, right? And politics clearly affects how we think, feel, and behave. We also see social psychology getting more and more involved in environmental studies and environmental issues and public health issues, particularly now with the pandemic, right? And understanding people's behaviors during the pandemic, and various related issues. So you see that social psychology is branching out into many different fields. So social psychology and the brain, or the brain and body, within social psychology, as a broad field, we have what's known as social neuroscience. This is a little controversial. This is the study between neural and social processes. I say it's controversial because a lot of researchers who do this type of work will often try to apply their findings in ways that I think should not be applied. For example, using an fMRI as a sort of new and improved polygraph machine. I think that's irresponsible to do, right? When it comes to social neuroscience, there's definitely a role for it, definitely a space for it within the field. It's a growing field, so I'm not gonna poo-poo it too much here. It's just, for me, I'm not convinced yet. But I'm also not an expert in that area. Maybe if I read more, I'd be more convinced. We also have this notion of embedded cognition. And embedded cognition focuses on the close links between our minds and the positioning, experiences, and actions of our bodies. So people's perceptions and judgments reflect and can influence their bodily experiences. So embedded cognition might say, sitting in a certain way within an environment can affect your feelings and your behaviors and your thoughts. We see embedded cognition, some of that research taking place more in educational type of studies or educational research to see whether or not active movement or what people are doing with their bodies can actually help them retain information, learn a new skill, or recall certain information. So essentially, it's a newer, not new, but newer way to try to understand the interaction between our bodies physically, our bodies, our positioning of our bodies and movements of our bodies, and our cognitive processes, our mental processes, our cognitions. So some of the newer technologies that exist are finding their ways into social psychological research. Still kind of slow because these technologies are incredibly expensive. For example, we're not going to get a fMRI machine at SUNY Oneonta anytime soon because, well, we don't have tens of millions of dollars to spare on it. But these new technologies are non-invasive procedures that allow researchers to study the interplay of the brain and what might be discrete thoughts and feelings and behaviors. Some of these technologies include the PET, so positron emission tomography. This involves injecting a participant with a radioactive glucose, a very small, low radioactive glucose, and using imaging to see what parts of their body are actually consuming that glucose. So if we're taking a look at the brain, areas of the brain that are more active are going to consume more of this sugar, so they should light up more. PET scans can actually be used to diagnose and monitor cancer or tumors as well in other parts of the body, because tumors are fast-growing cells. They're fast replicating cells, so they consume a lot of sugar. So if you would see a mass that is lighting up in there, it could be cause for concern. We also have event-related potential measurements that we can measure individual neurons, transcranial magnetic stimulation, which involves temporarily disabling parts of your brain and essentially seeing what that does. So sounds a little crazy. I'll show you a video of how that works in a minute here. And of course, the fMRI, functional magnetic resonating imaging. So the fMRI and the PET scan are similar in that they're called metabolic imaging. They allow us to see metabolic processes. In other words, what parts of the body are consuming. In the PET scan, sugar. In the fMRI, oxygen, right? So when it comes to the fMRI, if you've had one of these, you know what this is about. You get put into a tunnel that has a really powerful magnet in it, and they turn this thing on, and they're basically trying to shake up the blood cells that are in your body, right? Or the cells in your body. And this is where that resonance comes from, because deoxygenated parts of the body will have a different resonance than oxygenated cells. So they'll produce different waves that can then be put together into an image that shows us what parts of, let's say in our example, what parts of the brain are consuming more oxygen than other parts of the brain. We also have virtual reality technology that is finding its way into social psychological research. Still pretty early, still pretty new. And of course, online communication and the internet in general is a big source for social psychological research questions, and as a tool for conducting social psychological research, particularly survey research. So here's a video on the transcranial magnetic stimulation. Let's give you an idea of how this works.
My name is Flavio Oliveira. I'm a neuroscientist at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm studying how people make decisions by looking at one of the most common decisions people make in everyday behavior, which hand they're going to use for an action. This happens hundreds of times during the day, where you decide that you're going to use your right or left hand to press an elevator button, for example, or pick up an object. And we don't normally think about this decision-making consciously, but our brain has to process a whole lot of information in order to make those decisions. In our experiments, our participants play a little game in a virtual reality setup where they have to reach towards targets with their hands, and they have to make a choice on whether they're going to use the right or left hand. And when they're doing this, when they're just about to make a decision, we stimulate their brain with this technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. What TMS does is it creates these magnetic pulses that penetrate the skull and hit the brain non-invasively and harmlessly, but it induces electrical activity that disrupts the function of a particular brain area that we're targeting. And as we stimulate participants' brains, they end up choosing to use one of their hands more often. So essentially, by stimulating the left side of the brain, for example, we're disrupting the planning of the right hand and making people use their left hand more often.
Okay, so you can see that's a pretty good example of using both virtual reality technology and also using TMS. I have a video here that will show you the use of fMRI. The use of an fMRI to study people's decision making, people who have autism. And we would consider autism to be related to social psychology, even though it's typically falls in the domain of clinical psychologists. It's a very social disorder, right? So here we go.
Every year in the U.S., 1 in every 100 children are diagnosed with autism, a complex developmental disorder that affects a person's ability to communicate and interact with others.
One of the critical factors in social interaction is understanding other people's thoughts and other people's minds. So they do not have that ability, or we can say that that ability is much less in people with autism in understanding other people, and that breaks down the whole enterprise of social interaction for them.
UAB psychologist Dr. Rajesh Khanna is using fMRI to learn why people with autism lack this skill.
fMRI is one of the most sensitive tools to examine the brain function, So we can give this type of scenarios and see what exactly is happening in their brain.
With fMRI, Dr. Khanna can observe changes in blood flow in the brain.
When you are thinking, it's an active process, so the blood is going to rush to that area. So what we are measuring through fMRI is indirectly the blood flow. So what we present is a series of comic strips. And they watch lying down in the scanner this comic strips coming up, and we ask them the question, what exactly is going to be the most logical ending to this comic strip? The other condition, we give social interaction scenarios and ask them what's going to happen next, And in that case, to pick up a logical ending, they have to think about the character's mind to get into that. In areas which are supposed to respond to social thinking, they do not respond that well in people with autism. In areas you're supposed to respond to language processing, those areas don't respond well. But at the same time, I don't want to give an impression that in none of the areas are functioning well. If you look at the backside of the brain, like occipital or parietal lobe, which is these areas are mainly involved in visual processing or visuospatial processing. Those areas function reasonably well.
Dr. Khanna says this research could lead to interventions to address the social difficulties of people with autism. Every year.
Okay, so that wraps it up for this chapter, chapter 1, which is just a brief introduction to the course. Chapter 2 will be a brief introduction to the various research methods that we use in social psychology. So stay tuned for that lecture. It's on its way. I'll see you all next week. Take care. Bye-bye.